And let's get some more analysis with Schulz, an economist at the global bank Citi. Good to see you, Christian. Now, let's be straight here. Are we looking at 10% inflation in the Eurozone this year?
Well, at this point, you can't rule out anything. Inflation seems to surprise to the upside every time it comes out. It's different sources of surprises, but it just keeps surprising as supply shocks, as we call them, keep piling in. We're currently seeing the peak of inflation more in the 9% range in September, but that's extremely sensitive to the path that energy prices will take from here.
You talk about these supply shocks, but they're happening all over the world. If inflation's soaring from Europe to the UK here, to the United States, why does it matter?
That is a good question, in particular when it comes to the central bank question, which Ross raised in the interview earlier, because it really matters, of course, what is driving inflation as to what the right response to it is. What we're seeing clearly is a series of supply shocks, mainly related to the pandemic. During the pandemic, we weren't producing what we're normally producing around the world, so there were these disruptions to global supply chains. Goods were in short supply, and that obviously raises prices given the same amount of demand. We also saw that energy wasn't produced, there was less investment into energy production, less storage and that's hurting us now. And that has ripple-on effects, for instance, on food because of fertilizers and energy use in food. So one supply shock leads to the next one, which normally you would look through because they're all temporary, but they just keep on accumulating to the point where you just can't ignore them anymore. And on top of that, at least in some economies, there seems to be a demand component as well, because people were sent checks during the pandemic, even though they weren't working, and that's added to the problem.
So it's a combination then of pandemic hangover, energy prices. What you didn't mention, though, was the crisis in Ukraine.
The crisis in Ukraine, the conflict there clearly has an additional impact. It was kind of building up before the actual escalation in February already. You saw gas prices already rising last summer, perhaps related to the tensions there already at the time. There was, of course, an additional effect when it actually happened. What is now the consequence, which is clearly emerging, is mainly on food prices, because Russia and Ukraine are both important exporters of certain grains as well as of fertilizers. So that's now over the already and probably continuing over the next few months going to drive up food prices. So on top of the energy component, we now see a shortage of certain foods and therefore rising food prices as well.
And all of this is creating huge headaches for central banks around the globe. So what can we expect? Take us through it region to region.
Yes, I mean, the problem with supply shocks is there's very little central banks can do about it. A rise in the interest rates doesn't automatically bring down inflation. What it does is it brings down demand because there's less investment. Households can borrow less money or they have to pay higher interest rates. So it's bringing down demand. It doesn't restore supply. It doesn't create any new oil. It doesn't improve food supplies. It doesn't restore global supply chains. So it's the question whether it's the right tool. However, as I said, the accumulation of supply shocks risks de-anchoring inflation expectations. So there's a risk of second round effects that we see wage growth, for instance, picking up beyond productivity growth. And that would really de-anchor the global financial system. And that's something that central banks have to respond to. So there is certainly a role for interest rate hikes everywhere around the world, but to different degrees. We know, for instance, in the US, we, beyond these supply shocks, have very, very strong demand. The economy is in a very, very good shape. So there, you really have to bring down demand. That's why we expect the Fed to hike interest rates to almost 4% by the end of next year. In Europe, where it's almost exclusively supply shocks or exogenous inflation, as we call it, these steps are likely to be more modest. We expect positive interest rates, perhaps even all the way up to 1%. Our call is at the moment just 0.5%. And then there's places like Japan, Switzerland, where inflation even now is still quite low, where these moves are likely to be even more modest.
Christian Schulz, pleasure talking to you. I think we're all going to be talking about exogenous inflation from now on. Thank you.
Thank you.